Hey, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Library Company Philadelphia and for tonight's event, Only the Clothes on Her Back with Dr. Laura Edwards. My name is Fran Dolan. I'm the Director of Operations for the Library Company, and we are very excited to continue our Power and Pomp Fashion History at the Library Company series of events with Dr. Edwards tonight. Every Thursday in April, we will be exploring this topic, so I hope you can join us for the remainder of these events. If there's anything you missed or want to catch up on, they're all on our website to check out, so please do so. The Library Company of Philadelphia was founded in 1731 and is an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through the 19th centuries. Free and open to the public, the Library Company houses an extensive non-circulating collection of rare books, manuscripts, broadsides, ephemera, prints, photographs, and works of art. Our mission is to foster scholarship in and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving and interpreting the valuable materials in our care. To that end, we host a wide range of free public programming, which is what brings us all here this evening. As always, I'd like to acknowledge all of our wonderful members and shareholders whose contributions really keep us going and enable events like tonight to be possible. You can check out our website if you're interested in learning more about membership or shareholding. It's librarycompany.org. You can also learn more about access to member-only events. And I'd like to give a big thanks to Blanche Brown, our events and programs coordinator, who put together much of tonight's program and is handling the tech and the live stream for tonight. At the end of the presentation tonight, we'll have a Q&A. If you're here in the audience, you can raise your hand and we'll get to you. If you're watching at home, you can submit your questions through the Q&A function in your Zoom. And we also have copies of Dr. Edwards' book, Only the Clothes on Her Back, available for purchase and signing after the event tonight. Laura Edwards is the class of 1921 Bicentennial Professor in the History of American Law and Liberty at Princeton University. Her work focuses on the legal history of the 19th century United States with an emphasis on people's interactions with law and the legal system. She holds a BA in American Culture from Northwestern University and a PhD in History from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She taught at Duke University for 20 years before coming to Princeton. She's the author of 5 books, including A Legal History of the Civil War and Reconstruction, A Nation of Rights, and The People and Their Peace, Legal Culture and the Transformation of Inequality in the Post-Revolutionary South, which was awarded the American Historical Association's Littleton-Griswold Prize for the Best Book in Law and Society, and the Southern Historical Association's Charles Sydnor Prize for the Best Book in Southern History. She has received fellowships from the Newberry Library, the National Humanities Center, the NEH, and the ACLS, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Bar Foundation. Tonight, she is here to talk about her book, Only the Clothes on Her Back, Clothing and the Hidden History of Power in the 19th Century United States, released in February of this year by Oxford University Press. Welcome, Dr. Edwards.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Blanche, for putting us together. And thank you for all coming, especially in the pouring rain. I really appreciate it. And I also just want to thank the Library Company. I did research here in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and it was an incredible experience. And I really couldn't have done this project without all of the resources here and the support of the archivists. So thank you so much. So we're going to start out here with 6 women and a sheet. So I want to begin here because all of these, the women and the sheet, appeared in the New York City Mayor's Court in 1804. But actually, in fact, it was the sheet that started it all. One of the women, Sarah Allingham, was charged another woman, Judith Friel, with stealing the sheet. But actually, these charges vastly oversimplified the situation. Judith Friel, you have to pay attention here because we have 6 women, so we're like 1 right now, 2 right now. Okay, so Judith Friel was a washerwoman who just happened to have the sheet amongst the dirty laundry that she was collecting that day. So she's collecting dirty laundry in New York City streets. And just imagine her consternation when all of a sudden Sarah Allingham waylays her in the street, right? So she grabs all her bundles of laundry and then she starts rummaging through them all. She waves around this thing that she says was her sheet. It's in a bundle, this huge bundle of laundry, by the way. And then she marches off to file charges. And so we have Judith Friel kind of following in her wake there. So once in the New York City Mayor's Court, it became clear that Judith Friel, bless her heart, was actually just transporting the sheet. And it was another woman, Sally Riley, who had taken the sheet nearly a year earlier. Riley had then sold it to yet another woman, Rosanna Morara, and she was the woman whose laundry, the bundle of laundry the sheet was actually in, right? So both of those women then joined the other two. So we have 4 women in this sheet, like I said, and then 2 more appeared as witnesses to support Rosanna Morara's claims that she had purchased the sheet from Sally Riley, bringing us to 6 women in a sheet. So after listening to all of this evidence, and I'm imagining the mayor's court here and the mayor, official, like, okay, what's going on? I'm trying to figure this all out. The court awarded the sheet to Rosanna Morara. She had evidence to prove ownership in the form of witnesses who could describe it. It was homespun, it was seamed down the middle. They could provide the date of purchase. It was the previous winter because there was snow on the ground, right? And they could also identify the purchase price, which was 6 shillings. So Allingham only had outrage and a lot of drama, which is impressive, but ultimately not dispositive. So case closed, but actually not really, because in fact, this verdict raises all these more questions than it actually resolves. So first, there is the time and the effort devoted to this one sheet, which actually seemed way out of proportion to its value. Yet it was clearly memorable and meaningful to all of those involved. Even court officials, who were all white men, dutifully heard out all of this evidence in the court, and they never questioned the item's importance. Nobody told the women to go away because it's just a sheet, so who cares? And all the attention then lavished on this one sheet raises another question. Why did these women in this sheet appear in the New York Mayor's Court at all? So Sarah Allingham and Rosanna Morara were married women whose legal status was restricted by coverture. And coverture had rules that prohibited married women from prosecuting civil or criminal cases on their own in their own names, entering into contracts, and owning most forms of property, at least, not with some kind of workaround. But the court officials who adjudicated this case accepted both women's claims to property ownership and their access to the legal system. For court officials, as well as the women involved, the question was which woman could own the sheet, not whether a woman could own the sheet. So then, what does this sheet, these women, in this case, say about lawn commerce in the United States? And these are the questions that are at the center of my book, Only the Clothes on Her Back. And as I hope to explain, textiles like Sarah Allingham's sheet open up a very different view of the United States in the 19th century. This is kind of a history that you didn't know was there, that I didn't know was there, and I've spent kind of decades trying to figure out, as I'm seeing shadows there, what's going on actually. So by textiles here, I mean all cloth, as well as clothing and related accessories, which were all treated similarly in law. So by textiles, it's kind of a legal category. All these goods are treated similarly. And then the book develops 3 related themes. So first, there are all the material goods themselves, the textiles. And the book is really as much about them as the people who used and claimed them, which is why the sheet is at the center of that opening case. So in particular, the book traces the legal qualities that attach to textiles and then transferred to the people who possess them, allowing all those people without strong claims to property rights to make legal claims to this form of property. And those claims were then widely recognized throughout the New Republic in various kinds of court systems. So as such, textiles broaden this conventional historiographical focus that we usually have. Instead of looking at the status of people, I'm looking at the ways that property actually mediated people's relationship to law. And with textiles, you could make legal claims without actually altering your legal status as a person. A wife still had restrictions placed on her, and an enslaved person still had restrictions placed on him or her. But in fact, textiles allowed them to make property claims. And this is why I talk about a whole range of people, women and men, white people, Black people, rich and poor, all in the same book, because they had one thing in common, which was textiles and the way they used them. Second, there are the institutional implications here. So this is kind of like the boring part of the book, actually, I think, but I still find this incredibly important for understanding US history, right? So textiles actually expose all of these layers in the New Republic's federal system that carried over from its colonial past and that have gone largely unremarked in historiography. We think of the New Republic as actually new, and a lot of the legal practices and institutions carry over. It's old, in fact. And these spaces that carried over played a significant role in governance. And in particular, peoples on the margins had wider latitude in them than is usually assumed. And then third, there are the economic implications. So the legal qualities of textiles made it possible to convert these goods into a range of economic instruments that were otherwise inaccessible to them. So they used them as currency, they used them as capital, and they used them as the basis for credit too. So the fuss then over Sarah Allingham's sheet is not just one case. This is not unusual at all. And once you start looking for textiles, you realize that they are everywhere. And I know this because it took me a very long time to research this book, because textiles are all over the place in all of the sources. People talked about them, they made them, they sold them, they squabbled over them all the time. And existing scholarship has kind of passed this by, looking at textiles as consumer goods and something that is, more insignificant. And instead, historians tend to focus on other kinds of property that we assume are at the basis of the economy: enslaved property, commodities, other forms of capital, real estate. And those kinds of property are identified with all of the men that we also assume to be the nation's leaders. But all of that was out of reach for the vast majority of Americans. Only the minority of the population could actually own those forms of property. Everybody else was either too poor to afford them or didn't have the rights necessary to own them at all. So for most Americans, if they owned anything of value at all, it was textiles. And textiles had real value in this period. They're not just cheap toss-away consumer goods. Their legal claims to these goods then reveal this really different trajectory of legal change than those posited in narratives that focus on the rights of individuals. And they're at the center of the way we see US history more generally. So rather than exclusion, where people don't have rights, then we go to inclusion, where people do have rights. And then we say, well, why aren't they still equal? This is a narrative of twists and turns of the way that people had access to law even before they had rights, and then about the downsides of rights, even when they were able to possess those. So the first part of the book, it's in three parts. And the first part is called Old Clothes for a New Country. And this situates the new republic within the textile trade, a global textile trade, the dynamics of which predated the revolution by centuries and which continued to shape its political economy long after the revolution. So as textiles suggest, much about the new republic was actually pretty old. So textiles had been moving through this global market long before Europeans even knew about the Americas. And governing officials, and they're trading all of these silks, these cottons, all over the world, in fact, and the settling of the colonies is part of that larger trade. And governing officials in the early modern period did their very best to control this lucrative trade. But the trade restrictions that were in place at the time acknowledged a well-established reality, which was a highly competitive global market characterized by mass production in the early modern period, which made imported cloth more cost-effective than many domestically produced varieties, even in countries with well-developed textile industries. So we imagine that all of these places are like the women are making cloth in their households. And in fact, this is a highly commercialized economy that is developing, in fact, in the 1500s, 1600s. So the North American colonies are part of this, and they provided a ready market for textiles that were produced elsewhere. In fact, most of the textiles in the colonies were imported. Even just everyday rough cloth was imported. And the revolution was fueled in part by colonial merchants' desire for a greater share of that market. And it's no accident that they dumped tea into Boston Harbor instead of textiles, because actually textiles would have been an incredible waste, right? Better tea than textiles, which are far more valuable. Then after independence, the trade in and production of textiles made fortunes for the new nation's leaders. If you scratch the surface of most of the people who are leading the country, you find some roots in the textile trade. And we know all of this part of the story because it's been very well documented. But we've not yet teased out the full range of textiles' wide-ranging implications for the new republic's political economy more broadly beyond those few men. And an issue here is scale. So when the scale of the inquiry is at more 30,000 feet and it's fixed within the borders of the United States here, what comes into focus is the economic and political power of the new republic's leaders. Those men seem to occupy center stage, if not completely in control of the ship of state, then certainly at its helm. And what we see is a really rigid legal order that, if anything, became more hierarchical over time, marginalizing women, the enslaved, people of color, and working people. So we see restrictions on those people. Focusing on textiles actually alters the scale, exposing economic and legal dynamics over which the new republic's leaders had far less control. So textiles had always followed these paths that traverse the jurisdictional and geographical boundaries of states and nations, and they continued to do so after the revolution. So while this trade is global in reach, so it's moving across all of these spaces, the trade in textiles is also decidedly local. It's this weird kind of global thing and then local, and then states and nations sort of less important in here. So once finished textiles landed in a particular place, this sort of abstract market that described the global market becomes a particular place, an actual market, right? At the marketplace, where particular people had very particular tastes, and those tastes were not always very logical or easy to determine. So some places like big flowers, some places like small flowers, some places you could sell purple fabric, some places you could sell green fabric, some places like this. They're always trying to determine where to find the right thing to sell in the right place. So most of the people who make up those local markets are actually the ones whose legal status was limited. Those are the people without property rights. So we have this really interesting irony there of all these merchants making, fortunes off of selling property to people who can't legally own property. And what we see from this perspective then is a very different kind of legal order, one with so many moving parts that it's actually difficult to pin all of this down. And it's certainly difficult for these nations leaders to control. There's more going on here. There are different jurisdictions. There's federal, there's state, there's local. There are different bodies of law that moved across these jurisdictions, and there are different practices that move across these jurisdictions, including the idea that clothing belongs to the person who wears it. And that is so deeply embedded in practice that it is also moving across all of these jurisdictions at this point. So these legal qualities then sort of go through the entire system. And I have to tell you the story of Roger Taney because I found this so incredibly fascinating. I think Roger Taney, the Supreme Court Justice, would play a role in this particular story, this book, but he does. So he actually spent a great deal of time sorting through the legal status of textiles from his perch as the circuit court judge in the Southern District of New York, which is part of the federal system. So my favorite case was Roger Taney and his long underwear. It's not his long underwear, but he's adjudicating this. And the question is whether it's knitwear or ready to wear, which matters. It really matters because, I think it does, but knitwear, the custom duties were lower than for ready to wear. And you can see the conundrum, right? Because it would come off the knitting machine ready to wear, but it's knit, right? So big legal issue here. So in this case, as in so many others, the legal qualities actually of the textiles long underwear were what determined the case. So what they do is they bring all these jobbers and all of these merchants from the lower Manhattan, and they're walking. It's like, no, it gets sold as knitwear. It's not ready to wear. I know it looks ready to wear and you can put it on, but no, it's knitwear. And they're all feeling the goods. They bring in the goods. They look at them, and I imagine Roger Taney, because this particular long underwear has cotton, sort of around the collar so it doesn't itch, and people are like, oh, that's good. How much did you say these things were? So they end up, determining all of this based basically on the textiles. And Taney's work, though, in the Southern District of New York actually bore a striking resemblance to that of the officials who were kind of down the way, who decided Sarah Allingham's case in the New York City Mayor's Court. We think of these things as, oh, those are completely separate, but textiles run through all of this. And so, in fact, it took me a couple of days sitting in the federal archives before I realized that this Roger Taney with the long underwear was the same as the Roger Taney who decided the Dred Scott case. Because it seems so different. How could it be the same guy, right? I'm thinking, Roger Taney, there's another Roger Taney in the federal courts, and who knew? It must be a more common name than I thought. And it's like, oh, it's the same guy, because this is what he's doing through actually most of his decisions. In fact, Dred Scott is not representative of the work that Roger Taney did. So in this context, law is not really confined to state houses and courthouses or elected officials and legal professionals in the way that we assume it's this kind of top-down thing. Instead, with textiles, you have to see law in a different way, that it rested in the practices of ordinary people, practices that were created through custom, through use, and that were then recognized by legal officials, which is a very different way of understanding law. But ultimately, the people for whom textiles mattered the most were not Roger Taney or the jobbers in Lower Manhattan, because they had rights to possess property, but those who remained subordinated within the new nation legally, politically, and economically. So people of nominal legal standing were well aware that they could make claims to textiles, and that textiles connected them to their bodies, which meant that they could sell those, which also meant they had legal claims to them, which created all sorts of other possibilities in their lives. And this was very clear in testimony of Katie, an enslaved woman who also lived in New York City. She was charged with running away from her master. This is when slavery was still not, they're phasing slavery out in New York. But she was also charged with stealing a bundle of clothing. And in court, she admitted to absconding, but not to theft. It's like, yeah. I ran away, but I didn't steal the clothes. Because as she explained, she was taking what was hers because she wore the garments while working in her master's household. So the clothing belonged to her, in other words, even though the body that wore them did not. And this was very clear to her and very clear in the legal system. And these legalities are so entrenched and so powerful that officials had to deal with them, even if they conflicted with other kinds of laws and legal principles. And, there's this conflict of all these laws and legal principles in this jumble of jurisdictions that exist at this time. So the second part of the book then is called Protective Garments in a Hostile World, and it turns to the ways that people use those legal qualities of textiles. So people had been using textiles actually as economic instruments long before the establishment of the New Republic. But the New Republic's legal order created these new spaces for all of these practices to flourish, and they also allowed ordinary people to pick those up, use them, and make them part of their life. So I got into monetary policy here with this book in ways I hadn't thought I would. And it's fascinating because in the decades following the revolution, there was never enough currency, which struck me as odd when I was like, people are going to buy textiles. How do they buy them? And I realized that most of my understanding of buying things came from Little House on the Prairie, which is probably not a good source. So I went through and, I had to sort of reconstruct how people use currency and how they buy stuff, actually. So in those decades after the war, the proliferation of different kinds of notes of exchange, all these kinds of notes, people would produce, different banks would produce notes of exchange, states produce notes of exchange, people produce notes of exchange, and they're all valued in a unit of account, which are pounds and shillings initially, and then dollars and cents. But the proliferation of these meant that you never knew what you had. It's like, okay, how do you know what it's actually worth? It says it's worth $5, but it might not actually trade for $5. And then after Andrew Jackson nixed that whole Bank of the United States thing in the 1830s, there was currency everywhere, even more currency, which made it even more unstable. So I have court cases where they'll list out like banknotes that have been stolen, and they'll say, okay, this is the banknote from wherever bank, and it's $5, but it's worth $2.50. Here's one that is for $10 and it's worth nothing. And you always have to track the bank and try to figure out how much this is worth, which is really complicated and really unknowable. I'm surprised anybody could buy anything at all, frankly. But then more importantly here, there are all these legal restrictions on enslaved people, wives, make it very suspicious for them to have banknotes and even coins, because technically they're not supposed to own property. So if they're walking around with the means of buying property, there might be something wrong there. So textiles then satisfied this demand for reliable mediums of exchange that most people could actually use. So at this time, textiles had all the qualities that marked other forms of currencies. There's considerable consensus as to their value because people are well versed in this kind of goods and they can assess the value. They're extremely liquid and they stored value pretty reliably, actually more reliably than banknotes for certain. And they do get worn and used, but you can see that. And then you can discount based on actual knowledge, right? So it's more reliable that way too. And then more importantly, people could make legal claims to these textiles. So where the possession of all those other forms of property and currency raised red flags, the possession of textiles was less remarkable. So you're walking down the street, you're poor, you're a person of color in New York City, and you got a stack of banknotes. Well, somebody's probably going to stop you and say, why do you have a stack of banknotes? If you're walking down the street with some shirts, it's like, well, whatever. It's just less remarkable that way. And then people went and pegged textiles to the units of account set by the state. So they value these in pounds and then later dollars, like other forms of currency. Like a handkerchief would be $1 generally in the 1830s, and then you discount based on its use. And if it's silk, then you kind of add on at the other end. So there's fairly standard ways of doing this. And they come in various denominations, from like a handkerchief to large bolts of cloth. So you can buy small things and large things, and you can also cut them up. So when people looked at a piece of cloth or an item of clothing, what they really saw was pounds and shillings. Like you would have dollar signs all over you if you were in the 1830s. So the economic currency of textiles is rooted in their cultural currency. People have to know what they are to be able to value them. And then clothes are also so closely connected to the individual who wore them that they're literally defined as the essence of that person. And this connection made for this distinctive way of seeing the world and moving through the world too. So it's not just that these things have dollar signs on them, but it's also that you're accustomed to looking at clothing in a way that we don't so much today. So people walk through the world noticing these things. And when they notice these things, they also know the value of these, because this has become sort of widespread cultural currency. So we have this declining prices of textiles in the late 18th, early 19th century. So this puts more textiles into the hands of more people. And so this extends their cultural meanings more broadly. And that knowledge is on prominent display in all of these theft cases. So parties to these cases would describe cloth and clothing in great detail, not only distinguishing cheap goods from expensive ones, but also rattling off all this information about like fiber content, colors, patterns, wear that most people today would never notice, let alone remember, but they remember because this is a very different sort of cultural context. And all those details then establish value more accurately than figures on a banknote. And it is easy to miss the use of textiles as financial instruments because they also functioned as consumer goods. And such is the case with Elizabeth Cooley here, whose work weaving and sewing might seem kind of like typical domestic labor. She lived in Western Virginia. She weaves, she sews, she does all this stuff, right? But actually she and her sisters and her mother ran a textile manufactory, keeping the proceeds of what they made and then sinking all that back into more textiles. And they do that, buy more textiles, because textiles is actually capital for them. It's a property that they can keep. If they buy other things or even leave it sort of as credit at the store, that could easily be attributed to their husbands and become their husband's property and their father's property. And they really needed that because as the stories develop in the book, their husbands, their fathers have real economic failings. So they end up relying on the capital that they had saved through textiles. Now, popular culture then regularly decried such purposes as, evidence of the frivolity of women. You give them some money, they just go buy, clothes, whatever. Also people of color and the poor. But such purchases were hardly wasteful because they're really wise investments in the property that people can control and claim legally. So it makes it confusing, though, looking in the past, because their savings are essentially lying side by side with clothing that they wore. But you open up people's trunks and you find women with pants. You find people with household linens who don't have households. You find all sorts of textiles stored in these places that are essentially capital. So then people then traded textiles, they pawned them, they lent them, and they saved them to fund all kinds of future ventures. And the result was this vast kind of secondary market that not only provided access to the goods, but also a means to circulate them. So they're circulating all these goods outside the purview of retailers and outside the purview of governing officials, and also masters, husbands, fathers, and most importantly, the creditors, right? So this world is like keeping the property in the hands of people who can't own property by property rights. And this part of the market was kind of everywhere and included individuals who sold on streets and from their homes. And you get the real sense from reading like the New York City Mayor's Court records that you couldn't really walk down a city street in New York without running into somebody trying to sell you something involving textiles. So to say this market was underground or informal actually misconstrues the entire institutional underpinnings, because there are rules and rules that people know and they expect you to follow. Ownership is established through the relationship to the goods, like you being seen with them being on you. And if they're not on you, they need to be in your hands in some way. So that is witnessed by other people. So you bring in all these people who can actually testify to possession, use, and display, which is why you have 6 women in a sheet, right? Sarah Allingham ultimately lost that sheet because Rosanna Morara had that evidence to prove possession. Witnesses who could describe the property and value it, connect it to the purported owner, and provide the date of purchase and verify all of that. People, for instance, pawned cloth all the time in clothing, but they pawned it if they wanted it back. So you're essentially using it as leverage here for a loan and as collateral against which, you know, they then get money. But the expectation, though, that you keep a hold of that property because it's collateral, you haven't dispossessed yourself of it. So people charged with theft would often point out that they had pawned the goods. And by that, they mean that they intended they could get them back and therefore didn't really steal them. It took me a long time to figure this out. So you're charged with stealing something. And the guy comes in and it's like, I didn't steal it, I pawned it. I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's still stealing, right? It's like, no, it's not in their mind because they could always go get it and give it back. So they hadn't really stolen it. It's not really gone. Loans are different though. With loans, the owner expected return of the textiles of value plus interest in some way, but not the goods themselves. Like you blow your nose in somebody else's handkerchief, right? And it's like, no, you keep it, right? Because over time, textiles lose value. So what you want is not that good, but the value. And those rules matter. And Sarah Allingham, in her whole court case, where she's going through people's laundry in the middle of the street, is not just mad about her lost property. She's also mad that the rules structuring property exchange had been violated. So in fact, this case was not really theft in kind of the classic sense that we imagine. It was exactly the kind of credit dispute that is common in this part of the textile market. So Sarah Allingham had loaned the sheet to her neighbor, Sally Riley, not because Sally Riley was in desperate need of bed linens, but because both women were actually leveraging the value of the sheet. Riley then sold it to Rosanna Morara, which is actually accepted practice because in this kind of loan, you would be responsible for the value, returning the value. So the fact that she sold it didn't negate her responsibility to return that value to Sarah Allingham. And it was only after Allingham believed that Riley had reneged on the loan, remember it was 9 months that passed between when she stole it, which is really when she borrowed it, and then when this court case unfolds. It's only after then that Sarah Allingham is basically taking matters into her own hand and like repoing the property because that's all she's got left, right? But then she goes to court. She gets the property and then she goes to court. And she goes to court because those expectations of enforcement run so deep that people like her insisted on legal redress. The rules were important. And all of this was possible because of those layers in the legal system. So people without strong claims to rights are locked out of the area of law, civil law, that handled property disputes like debt cases. She can't file a case for like repayment of a debt. So when officials, when they get somebody like Sarah Allingham in their court, they're like, oh, gee, it's a debt case, but I can't actually prosecute a debt suit. What do I do? Well, we'll flip it over into a criminal offense. And they usually shift them into criminal matter as theft. So why this? Criminal matters are in the area of public law. And public law looked after the interests of the social order, not the rights of individuals. The point was to right egregious wrongs, basically, to put things aright, to put them back in their places where they belong. And that includes sheets, right? So within this legal rubric, court officials could act on complaints as threats to the public order, not a violation of Sarah Allingham's rights, but as a threat to the public order, of something gone awry, of something out of place. So they could even act then on these property claims made by those without property rights. And textiles fit really well within this concept of the public order because it's created through, those claims are created through practice that have become custom, that have become part of the public order. So prosecution then repaired that rift. It restored the property to the place where it belonged without recognizing the right of the particular people involved. So you might ask though, where are all these merchants and manufacturers in all of this? The ones we left behind back there at the end of the revolution who are making profits off the textile trade, right? So where are they? They're in a word, frustrated, extremely frustrated, because this market in textiles, its legalities confound them. So they're really in a bind because they depend on the business of people with tenuous claims to property to buy their goods. And yet there are also existing and supporting laws that deny them property rights to buy these goods. So the thing here is that merchants really want to sell textiles to people as consumers. Consumers, in their mind, are supposed to buy textiles. They're supposed to pay for them at the point of purchase. And then they're supposed to take them home, use them up, and then come back and buy more. They're not supposed to strike out on their own and turn these items into economic and legal power. They're not supposed to go trade them and use them as currency and save them as capital and create their own markets here. But merchants and manufacturers actually found it impossible to crack down on this part of the market because doing so, one, would damage their own interests because they still sell stuff, right? But beyond that, they also don't have a lot of control over these legal practices because they're so entrenched. They're more powerful than these merchants. And so this legal order in this period then is not entirely within these men's control. We have a different vision of what law and the legal order looks like. So then finally, though, we get to the third part of the book, which is called Rags. And this pans back out to deal with the broader implications of these legal claims. And here, sadly, the legal qualities of textiles only went so far because they could not cancel out the fact, one, that the value of textiles still continued to decline. So we were at a real sweet spot in the late 18th century, early 19th century, but then with actually the mechanization of cotton, the price of cotton goods goes down, but then it pulls the price of everything else down along with it. So there's that. But just as important, the framing of public law criminalized the varied property disputes of all these people who didn't have strong claims to property rights. So regardless of the property dispute, legal officials would put it into this category theft, but theft is a criminal charge. And so what that tends to do is separate these kinds of property exchanges from the other kinds that are handled in the civil part of the system. And it makes them seem different, it makes them seem illegitimate, and it makes them seem criminal. Now, the implications would become really inescapable later in the 19th century as the legal order also continued to evolve in the United States. So the claims of those without strong claims to property rights, the people who were using textiles, they existed in the parts of the legal system that emphasized relationships, practices that not only assumed a meaningful connection between person and the material world, but also required the participation of other people, if only as witnesses. So you got to bring your friends and family and all your goods in to establish claims to textiles. And those on the margins that had the best chance of making those kind of claims at the local level, where that was possible, where they could go with all their friends and family and relations and they could carry all their goods. That's where they could make those relationships visible. But then in the decades right before the Civil War, you have a real shift in the legal system. And legal authority starts shifting towards those areas of law that focus on the rights of unencumbered individuals. So those rights that allow you property rights in that area of civil law. That also starts framing criminal law as well, where they start focusing on procedural rights rather than all of the kinds of relationships to goods and people that were the means of establishing claims to textiles. Rights then strips out all of these relationships to focus in on an individual who's supposedly unencumbered. And those rights only belong to certain people, to free people unrestricted by slavery, by coverture, or the other racial, gender, and class-based restrictions that are allied with slavery and coverture. So free black people also had tenuous claims to rights, so did poor people. So they had a difficult time being those unencumbered individuals. Now, rights here, extremely important in this period. And I think this is really useful for understanding why they acquire such purchase in our legal system. So claims to textiles, right, all those practices, they stayed in place. And rights-based claims traveled freely. So if you can make claims to textiles in a particular place, you need all of that context to establish those claims. If you move to another place, those claims don't move with you. Rights-based claims move all through the federal system across all its messy jurisdictional lines. So there's this much needed legal constant in a system that was anything but constant. And this is more the case in the United States than it actually is in most other countries, at least in European countries and Great Britain. And it is difficult, really, to navigate a legal order that purports to be the same country, but then everything varies from state to state and then from locality to locality. It's like, how do you do business here? I mean, you would like something constant that moves across space, right? Rights do that. So this is really annoying to people in business, right? This whole inconsistent stuff. But they're not the only ones. This mess of laws also determines people's legal status and how they can move through the world. So you're a slave in one place, and all of a sudden you move over here and you're not a slave, right? And in fact, you may be enslaved in one place, but in local practice, you've established some sort of autonomy that allows you a life that isn't quite like slavery. But if you move someplace else, that's not possible. So this really matters to a lot of people. And there's a good reason why in the 1830s, 40s, you start getting a real organized abolition movement and also a movement for rights for free Blacks and for women as well. The problem, though, here is that the extension of rights came at the expense of textiles. Rights did not eliminate other aspects of the legal order that kept all women, all African Americans, and even poor white men from inhabiting the role of rights-bearing individual. Property rights for women were enacted piecemeal, but they never actually eliminated coverture and the other elements of coverture, for instance. So textiles had given all these people legal cover when they had difficulty claiming rights, but without them, they were vulnerable. So textiles mattered here because the legal options available to all Americans without rights or resources were so few. And their powers then are fragile and ephemeral, and they start to disappear once you get this rights-based order that promises to make people equal, but actually has a difficult time doing that. And here textiles reveal a history in which the extension of rights cannot be told really as this easy narrative of inclusion and progress. We'll find out rights to people and we'll start moving along the progress train. And so as people acquire rights, it is going to be a much more difficult kind of story here. And part of what makes this difficult is the elimination of the other kinds of legal practices that allow people to claim property and access to the legal system. And textiles then tell this different story of law and the economy. Interestingly, too, one where the experience of women is actually representative rather than those theoretical rights-bearing individuals. So here, the majority of the population is actually representative rather than the minority of the population that would hold up as a standard and then ask, why wasn't everybody else like that, right? So hence the title of the book, Only the Clothes on Her Back, because women emerge as those representative legal figures. They're the ones who are actually like the vast majority of Americans, even most men, with compromised rights who were thought to be on the outside of the economy and government. But in fact, as this book tried to show, is that they were always on the inside, that they could always imagine a world where they could in fact claim their labor, where they could possess property, where they could define their own destinies even before they had rights, because those things were possible for them to imagine. And this political and legal culture cut across and through different groups of people because of its roots in this deep past in this legal world that textiles reveal. So thank you. And if you have questions, let me know.
Well, thank you so much,
Sure.
Dr. Edwards. It was a very fascinating, interesting talk, and I'm glad that the library company was able to contribute to it in
Enormously.
some way. We do have time for a question and answer. So if anyone here has anything they would like to ask Dr. Edwards, maybe some questions coming in from home.
So the change from the textile, which was litigated criminally, to the people's rights, how did that happen? I mean, what was the transition? Was it laws being written that changed those things, and then those laws included the textile situations?
Right, it's complicated. It involves another piece of the story that I never thought, the development of the legal profession in the United States. So what you have is like you have the United States, it's like, oh, we need laws, right? We need some sort of legal traditions here. And so you get the development of sort of a professional vision of law. People start writing treatises. Treatises were often based on English treatises. Blackstone in particular, Sir William Blackstone's treatise is enormously popular. It's 4 volumes, enormously popular. And it's very rights-based, Blackstone's treatises. So what American lawyers start doing is modeling treatises after Blackstone and other English models. And a lot of these are emphasizing actually a particular area of law, civil law, the transfer of property amongst people with rights. And this makes sense actually because of this idea of rights traveling across space and jurisdictions. So you get the most emphasis there. But what ends up happening is you have all of this discussion about that area of law, about men who have rights and how you trade that and who owns what when and what contracts look like and how you know when the transfer is actually made and how you prove all of that. And then also how you establish all those claims in sort of procedural areas in court with the presumption that you already have rights. So we're worried about the actual legal process and the rights involved in that. That starts taking out this outside space in the ways that legal training is done. They never write about textile practice in those treatises. So textile practice kind of goes away in the written records. And then they start using those treatises to train more lawyers. And then lawyers just read that. And so the young lawyers don't know about the textile practices. And then they start writing all of that into the statutes and the appellate cases. So the textile practices like disappear there. It becomes something that looks increasingly not legal because if you look at a treatise, it's not there, right? Which doesn't mean it's not there. It's just not there in those records. And then historians went back in there and they were like, well, I read written records, so I read this. And they don't know about textiles either because you actually have to look at like local cases and look at what people are doing, which is not how we usually think about law, right? So it kind of disappeared that way. And it started seeming to, like if you were born in the 1790s and you were a lawyer, you would know this stuff. Obviously, all these local officials still know this stuff. But if you're like 18 and you're trained in the 1850s, you have no clue anymore. So that's kind of how that happens, which is interesting in the way that it's not like forcibly pushed out, but just through the way that the documentation works. And then the elevation of the written record over other kinds. Yeah.
This is wonderful. Thank you. I'm wondering when you look at textiles of value and currency, you touched on the kinds of extreme recycling.
Oh, yeah.
Finding value of things. Yes. Talk about that.
Yeah, no, like this, yeah. Oh, sure, I will. So asking about value, but then sort of the extreme forms of like the way that the textiles deteriorate and then become rags and what that's about. Yes, like Benjamin Franklin, that's what he does. He made a lot of money off of rags. And so interestingly, textiles become currency banknotes because they become rags and they make paper out of them and then they turn them into banknotes, which like high fiber content paper is quality paper, right? So I mean, yeah, it's a great metaphor, right? So you have the rag pickers, people then collect rags, and you would have rag pickers who would come through neighborhoods and city streets, and they're still doing this in the early 20th century. One of my colleagues at Princeton, Emily Thompson, has like recordings of rag pickers who come through, and then women, wives, daughters, grandmothers would, get money for the rags in their households. But this is all part of that sort of continuation of women's claims to textiles too, even at the point where they've deteriorated, and they're really nothing anymore. You can still actually kind of leverage their value. Yes.
Inventories included textiles commonly, or was it more art?
Oh, if what was? Inventories? Oh, like estate inventories. Oh, yes, that's really cool because, yeah, so example, sometimes yes and sometimes no. So an example of this is in Louisiana and the civil system, European law rather than Anglo-American common law, but this is an example of actually what happens in common law too. So they're inventorying the estate and you had the official going through and there was no will that gave any property to the wife. So he's going through and saying, or that was the wife's separate property either. So he's going through and inventorying everything. And he, every piece of furniture, everything that's in every drawer and cupboard. And then he gets to one armoire and he opens it up and he says, well, this is the wife's clothing. So I closed the door and moved on. So there is this expectation that the clothing that belongs to the wife will of course be hers. And it's also that container of an armoire, which is like a trunk, which is a legal container. which establishes the ownership of a wife. Laura Thatcher Ulrich has really fascinating stuff on cupboards, where cupboards move through women's, pass through women in the family line. But it actually is a legal concept too. So there are all these legal cases that have trunks. And I'm writing this down, I'm taking notes, and I keep coming across trunks. Like the trunk, the lid was open, the lid was closed. And I'm like, why the trunk stuff? I don't understand. And so it finally occurred to me that they're like looking at trunks. They have search warrants for trunks. The trunks are the way that if you don't have a house of your own, you establish ownership by putting your things in the trunk. Because if the property is in the household, it is presumed to belong to the person who owns the house. Most people don't have their own house. Children, wives, enslaved people, servants, poor people who are renting from other folks, they don't have their own house. So they have a trunk and they put the property there. So getting back to inventories, I realize it's a long explanation, but those containers would often be then excluded from estate inventories. Exactly, because they already belong to somebody else. So you wouldn't see, the only time you see it is when you have like a single woman or a single man who has died. And then because the property is all presumed to belong to that person, you would see it then, because then it has to be valued and whatnot. But otherwise, yeah, not so much. Yeah, and the other piece of that, though, that you do see in inventories are the means of producing textiles. And that's more contested. So for instance, the Cooley women, they have several looms, and the loom appears, one of those looms, or two of them, I forget, looms appear though in the husband's, the father's estate in the inventory. It doesn't ever belong to him though. I mean, it immediately goes into the wife's possession. So it's a little unclear sometimes. And in some of these inventories too, at the sale, the wives will buy back the tools of making the textiles at rock bottom prices, partly because it's presumed that it's really theirs, because it's the tools of their trade, not their husbands. But it's this more gray area there. And you can kind of see bed linens are similar too. Those will appear in state inventories, but often women are very insistent that those are theirs. And that's really crucial because bed linens are often the most valuable item in the entire state. So if a woman can claim all the bed linens in the entire household, I mean, she's actually now claimed most of the property in the entire household. So you can see why that would be contested. Yes.
Well, I'm going to ask a few questions on behalf of our virtual attendees. One attendee asks, are there any research rabbit holes you went down that were related to the topic but didn't make it into the book?
Oh my, I don't know. I tried to, the ones that I went down that were really, I didn't see them at first, and the trunks would be a good example of that. And weirdly, most of the rabbit holes I went down in this instance ultimately kind of made their way into the book. And I don't know why. I think it might be because this book took so long to research. I think I've been doing this since I was writing my dissertation, even though I didn't know I was doing this book then. So I had a lot of time to kind of think about how all this worked together. And for instance, the question about people being able to legally own their clothes when they don't have property rights, I've been thinking about that for about 20 years now. And I first ran across those cases 20 years ago, and I'm like, okay, I had this weird case where they said this dress belongs to like Robert Gilbert. I'm like, Robert Gilbert has a dress. This is a way more interesting case than I thought, right? I mean, it's possible, but I'm imagining Robert Gilbert in North Carolina behind his plow, in his dress. And I'm thinking, yeah, there's something else going on here. And so you flip open the page and then you realize that they've just filled out the outside of the form, the legal form that way, because it has to be his property to like make the case go forward in that legal venue. And then on the inside, you see that Robert Gilbert's not involved in this at all. It's his wife's dress, and it involves a whole bunch of women disputing this particular item of clothing. So I think if I had had to move more quickly and write something right away, that would have been a rabbit hole that I sort of looked at part way and thought, yeah, I'm backing out of that. But then if you have several decades to think about it, then, you can go down, I went down the rabbit hole a little bit, and then I came back out and thought about something else and was like, oh, let's think about that again. It gives you, I think, more time that way. So
Thank you so much. And Mackenzie Coker asks, did the recognition of textile ownership extend to all worn items, or were there exclusions?
So see, these are nebulous. Nobody writes this down. So at one point in an article, somebody said, copy editor said, I want you to cite the legal case that says that, trunks establish ownership. It's like, there is no legal case that says that. And then I went through sort of a crisis because it's like, well, do you want the 150 cases that I looked at to kind of come to this conclusion? If I give you 3 cases, you're going to think like I'm making this up because it's not clear in those 3 cases. How do you cite this stuff when what you're talking about is practice, which means volume? They didn't want me to cite 150 cases. They wanted the 1 case. So okay, now I'm losing track of the question. I got down that rabbit hole of what was the question again? I knew that there is I'm going to get to it. But.
So the question was, did the recognition of textile
Okay.
ownership extend to all worn items,
Yes.
or were
So
there?
it's practice in particular places. This is the point about the practice and the volume here. I knew there was a point. We're in my dinner time now, so practice, right? You need practice in particular local place. So it could be that somebody could claim shoes in one place and bed linens, which is really contested, shoes less so. Bed linens really contested in one place, but someplace else they would have a hard time doing that, right? So it's difficult to say at the edges because what people try to do is establish those claims. And if they can do it, then, they do. But in some places, they're not able to do that. And there's also, it's very uneven from place to place. So I can tell you what's kind of at the margins, which is, when you're trading in lots of uncut cloth, that can be on the margins. You have to work really hard to claim that. If you're also doing something that's more commercial in this venture, for instance, I have some enslaved people in the upcountry South Carolina who have businesses selling dry goods to other enslaved people. And you could see how that would be really difficult to kind of maintain legal claims to all of that. And you might be questioned, right? So that can be really dodgy there too. And then some of the more expensive items too. So, there are limits, outer limits, so that like if you're an enslaved woman walking down the streets of New York City and you have on the absolute most expensive dress that you could possibly find, you may get stopped. Of course, if you get stopped, you may still be able to establish that through the evidence that you own it. But it does, raise the possibility there that, if it seems way out of place, that may be, on the margins there. But it's always kind of iffy because interestingly, it's about the evidence, right? So like the court official will be like, okay, bring in the people. And you have these cases that are very unusual where, a wealthy white man will accuse a servant of stealing and the servant comes out okay because she has the evidence and it's clear why the case is going in that direction. So there's that. And what you see are the efforts of people to kind of continually expand out this category, because the fact that you can legally claim the clothes that you wear does not mean that you can legally claim the several thousand yards of cloth that you produce and sell, right? But they're extending that whole thing in creative ways. And because of that, it can be a little difficult there at the edges. Yeah. I know. Yeah. Yeah, no. So the question is, did I ever, get a chance to feel this? It's the eeriest thing when you run across the textiles themselves. I think this gets to that point that they're very closely connected to people's body, even to this day, right? I mean, it is this, somebody else's clothes has that quality of the other person. And, you'd be reading through letters and then women would write all the time, actually, trying to purchase fabrics. And you get this from wealthier women who are literate and who are writing letters, but actually all of this kind of, information that people pass all the time to try to get better versions of the cloth that they want or the kind of cloth that they want. It happens all the time. But then the letters, like women will clip a piece of fabric to the letter. And so you're flipping through the collection of letters and all of a sudden there's that piece of cloth and you can touch it and it's really cool. And you can like look at the print on it and you can kind of get a sense of it. So there's that. There are also the little clippings that, and there was one in there of, the merchants who will clip and say, here's the piece of fabric. We want more of this. Don't send us that other stuff, right? And you also see it, then that's 19th century, it also is the 18th century. And so there's a great collection in the New York Historical Society with a woman who is a textile merchant who has this incredible, volumes of, she has the clippings of the fabric and then all sorts of notes. I want this, but in a different color, I want that. And then in the court cases, you have the items, which I found fascinating. So you open up, the Federal District Court of the Southern District of Manhattan, and there's like pieces of stockings and like knit and like wool, and because they're arguing over whether this is what the cloth, the cotton to wool content of the fabric is. And then I also went to museums, and that was great because they have examples of the whole like garments and whatnot. And I spent a wonderful day at Kent State. Some of these places that have these materials, or you wouldn't expect to find them. So Kent State has this amazing collection. And the archivist there, we went through like dress by dress. And one of the things that I learned, for instance, there is like dresses, the styles would last actually longer than today. So this idea of, a consumer good, that you buy one dress and you throw it away. That's not what people were doing. You have the dress and then you remake it. So, you would put new trimmings on it, and that would be a way of rehabilitating the dress. But, long dresses, women, you kick the hem. I don't know if you've ever like had a long coat and you ruined the lining because you're kicking the hem. That's going to happen all the time with long dresses. And so you have to kind of remake the hem, and you would put, different kinds of trimmings along there and whatnot to do that. So you can kind of get a sense too then of like what the material qualities of these were and how people made them. And this is also, I think, one of the central pieces of this book, that looking at the material aspects is important because you got a sense of the skill involved. So, we kind of think, oh, women sew, it's just sewing, it's kind of domestic labor. We kind of shoved it here as to something that doesn't have skill. But people had skill in making this stuff. And what they were doing with their skill is making value. But here's the legal component, right? Is they're making value that they can actually keep. So this is different from like the little mill girl story where like women go into the factories, they're paid a wage, all the value of their labor is extracted by the mill owner. Here, actually, no, women continued to put skill into this particular kind of craft, and they're able to keep the value of that. And in fact, the more mechanization you get in the early 19th century, the more hand labor you have, the more fabric you have, the more you need sewing skills. And in fact, a lot of the other kinds of textile production other than cotton is still done by hand. So there, the actual demand for that also increases. So I feel like the material aspects of this are really important in understanding the value, and also kind of thinking about the importance that we sort of assume domestic labor, household labor, not commercial. And I'm seeing a world where there's a lot more fluidity back and forth there, and women are more clearly positioned in the commercial world. And I realize that may seem far afield from the material qualities of the goods themselves, but those qualities got me there with that thing.
Time for one more question.
This is actually a personal question.
Sure.
And you've talked about this or touched on this a little bit in this presentation, but in the book, you consistently make the point that people are sort of pressing for these legal powers. People in subordinate social positions are sort of manipulating or pushing for legal rights through textiles. Can you talk a little bit more about how people learned these legalities and how they learned to access these legal systems, and what that general relationship was like for different peoples, if that isn't too broad?
No, that's great. Do I need to repeat them? No, okay. So actually, all of this, because it's part of practice, you grow up knowing these things. So you grow up knowing, how you dress and what that means. And this is so embedded in the way that people are moving through the world. I think today we think of law as something outside daily life, right? So we have Supreme Court justices who are all trained at Yale or Harvard, but nowhere else. And they know these law things that we don't know. And judges know these things, legal professionals know these things, but the rest of us don't. And in this world, people actually see laws much more close to their daily lives. So it is partly because this is created through practice and people really feel like they can create legal concepts and principles that ought to be followed. So they're insistent on that in the way that they look at law, and they have a lot of opinions about what those principles should be as a result too. So they're moving in a world where law and the legal system operates on about a different set of assumptions than today. So they kind of learned this as they're growing up. And then taking the legal principles, they also feel like they have, in fact, the right and power to be able to expand those out. So it's not like, oh, here's the law that's written in the book and I can do that, but only that. It's like, well, here's this concept, but why not expand this out? Doesn't that make sense? So this is also the kind of thing I'm talking about where people had more flexibility. I wouldn't necessarily want to go back to this world, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there are spaces for people to have real opinions about law and be able to expand out legal principles through their practice, which gives them a lot more kind of agency and power and authority than what we usually give to them. And then as sort of another piece of this is that none of the exchange works without law. So in fact, if you're working in exchanging any kind of property in this period, you have to know those legal rules. So it's not like you can just exchange property and not know the rules. It's that to participate in the economy, you already know the rules, which are what structures the expectations that people are resting the entire kind of system on. Thank you for coming.